Hello and welcome to Culture in Between, a podcast all about exploring the unique experiences of people who grew up in a culture outside of their parents' culture. We are your hosts, Alyssa and Brianna, and in today's episode, we have the honor of interviewing Anuj, whose parents are from India. Anuj, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to interviewing you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. It's really excited to kind of talk about culture. I think it's actually been a big thing for me, not only in my personal life, but also actually at work, and how that's been a big thing of getting culture to grow inside of organizations. So I'm really excited to talk about it.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'll just kind of start us off by describing a little bit of how Anuj and I know each other. So Anuj and I used to work together at General Motors. I started back in 2014, and Anuj had been there a couple of years. And I was very, very green in my career. And I got placed on a project with him. Anuj was an architect. And he would sit patiently with me for hours and help me. And so I've always been super grateful to him for that. And so he's a good guy. And so he's always very helpful and really helped me kind of feel like my first project where I felt like, okay, I'm a real software developer now. So Anuj, thank you so much. Yeah, so that's how we kind of know each other, and we're just excited to get to speak with you. So do you mind maybe just providing a brief introduction of yourself for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, my name is Anuj. I've been in Texas most of my life, though I've been in other states. I've worked for a lot of different companies in my field. I work in tech, and have been an engineer and an architect and a leader in engineering for a long time now at different companies.
All right. So Anuj, obviously you are here to talk about your cultural background. So we always like to start by asking our guests where exactly in their parents' home country their parents are from. So can you tell us where exactly in India your parents are from?
Yeah, for sure. So my father's side, he is actually from Uttar Pradesh or New Delhi. That's where the central region is, where the capital of India is, and that's the northern side. A lot of his family and other things are all from that area, so not too uncommon. My mom's side is a bit more complicated because she's Punjabi, which is from the state of Punjab, which is also India and the northwestern side of it. But she was originally from Lahore, which is in Pakistan. So she was there and her family were there before the split happened between India and Pakistan, who were two different countries. When it was all one big one, she was on that side of the country, and then fortunately had to be a kind of move and leave when that split happened. And they ended up settling. I'm not sure where they settled, but they settled somewhere. And then, my mom kind of was hanging out there, I guess, for a little bit, having to leave with her family and everything. But that's kind of the interesting culture, because most people will ask, what are you in terms of your background from India? Because there's so many different states. And then that kind of also defines your cultural background. Like, are you Gujarati? Are you Punjabi? Are you North Indian, South Indian? Where are you from? And these kind of have these different cultural sets. And so for me, I'm kind of split. I'm from this somewhat northern side that's a little bit more conservative and a little bit more on that upper tier, because it's really in that high political area with New Delhi and a bunch of other things. And then my mom is Punjabi, which is a little bit more the wild side, I would say. I've been told, and has a little bit different cultural understanding of things. And so I guess I'm a mutt or a mix, is what I say. Even culturally, even though they're both Indian, even culturally, they've already got a mix, right? They're not both from the same cultural background a little bit.
Oh, so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, like India is such a huge country and regionally diverse and everything. So yeah, it's so true that this question is always important, but especially for India, I think it's very important to know exactly where your
Yeah.
family is from, because it's so different based on the region. So very, very interesting. So how old was your mother when the partition happened between India and Pakistan?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would have to calculate backwards
Okay.
my mom's age to find out, but I know she was young. I can't remember when the partition happened. Probably very bad Indian for not knowing all of India's history, but I'm sure I could Google it. But I feel like it was somewhere between the 50s and 60s. So she must have been very young still at that time when that was happening in between. But she's, it was kind of a little, they had, I know there's a whole cultural sidestepping of understanding of how that split happened and all the drama around it and everything else. But, unfortunately, they had lots of friends who were Muslim and were also helpful to help them escape and move on or get themselves shifted. And I think everything was just kind of wild back then, a little bit about how all that stuff happened, unfortunately. But I'm glad that they were able to make it, and then she got to where they needed to be. So, yeah. And obviously, funny things about being from different regions and cultural areas and diversities. My mom has a very distinctive physical features as do I from my mom's side, as I have that because she's from that area. So I get mistaken from being from that area as well, either being from Lahore or Pakistani, or sometimes something in between a Persian, or depending on who you ask and what they're familiar with. Because I have more my mom's side of features, and she's from, obviously her family was from that area, right? So it's not surprising versus other areas of India.
Very interesting. I'm sure we'll delve a little bit deeper into that as we go along. But first, let's start with your own upbringing and childhood. So, as you mentioned, you grew up in Houston, which is, I read the other day, is like most diversity in the U.S., which I think people
Wow,
outside
really?
of
I didn't know
Texas,
that. Yeah, that's cool.
yeah, people outside of Texas might be surprised to hear that. I was surprised to hear it. So, can you tell us, was there an Indian community there, or just, I mean, did you connect more with just a variety of cultures? How was it growing up as an Indian American there in Houston?
Yeah, well, let me first preface this question with I was actually born out in Louisiana, so I guess I'm a Cajun Indian, but I was only there for a little bit, maybe 6 months to a year, and then my father's brother got sick. Maybe I think he had like a heart condition or something, so we flew back to India, and I went to school there for 6 months. And like in early schooling there for 6 months, they decided they didn't like that. They flew back to New York. And then I was in Queens. I was living in Queens with my family for another 6 months, going to school there in New York. So New York has a special place in my heart too. And then I started when decided to move to Houston in Texas, and I started like first grade from there on. But like up until that, I was in like 3 different areas, like Louisiana, India, New York. So I was in a lot of places rapidly over a year and a half time frame.
Wow.
And I wanted to preface that because that kind of sets like, okay, so I already had an international barrage of experiences in schooling and like cultural overload. And then I got to Houston, and, growing up in Houston, like I said, people forget how diverse it is and how many different cultures. There's such a big city, and it's such a central hub, being next to the port and the oil and gas industry and everything else that goes on. But, my early days, I always felt a little bit like an outsider. And I think that was more traditional. While there was a lot of diversity, you were still being slightly different, not the majority race or ethnic, I guess, a group of people in there always made you feel a little subtle that things weren't connected. But over time, by the time I got to high school or even college, that was less and less of a thing because so much had changed. There's more opening, you meet more people, and you tend to connect. But I remember growing up as, elementary, I would connect more with those that were different. You naturally find the other different people and you try to say, hey, where's my group? This seems like a group that's also being different. Let's go talk to them. And so I met a lot of Filipino friends when I was growing up. So I had Filipino friends and some friends from different parts of, I think they were from different areas of Africa, and other ones that had just been born there. I also had other friends that were from like different European countries that we might consider as one ethnic Caucasian, but really there's a bigger demographic from Europe than you suspect, but people kind of lump some, we tend to always lump, unfortunately, by different areas for reasons or attributes about you. But all those kind of came together. But I think I never really worried about finding my cultural heritage, because one of the things to your question is that while in school, there wasn't that founding collaboration. I had to find my own, right? Find my other friends who I could feel like I connect with. My parents were very traditional Indian, and like most cultural communities, you tend to find a community. So they would find other Indian parents and friends with kids. And we would have a lot of family parties or get-togethers, right? So where they found friends, they found people they collaborate with, whether they're from the same cultural state, background, whatever that is, how they know each other, but they found the community. The community finds itself, right? They find each other in these little pockets. And so there was an Indian community that was in Houston and had been there, which is also why my parents moved, because there was people they would know and they could kind of grow with. And then we found those friends, and we would, again, every Friday or some weekend, there would be, an Indian family party. We would all go, and we'd all be good children while the adults talked and gossiped and did whatever. And we would sit our corner and meet some new kids that we had no idea anything about. They would be different ages, and up and down we would just play or do kid things, right? And as you got older, you grew up with them, right? So they're always your family friend. And that's a term you'll probably hear from a lot of Indian Americans growing up, is that we had family friends. And I think everyone has those, but this was a slightly different meaning or purpose in that this was your community family friends. Like this was part of that community culture, rather than saying, oh, well, this is just Susan from down the street and we were family friends and we play with your daughters. Like, yes, you were friends that grew up together because you were in the neighborhood. we're talking about cultural community family friends that bound you back to the community and the cultures and the practices of whatever that community was. And that's still super, super, super common today. And I think that's not specific to Indian culture, but any culture that tends to find itself.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I think my parents were always very good about. I don't know. We always had people who did like provided services for us or something in Miami, and they were. I don't know how they found them, but it's like always like a Jamaican handyman or a Jamaican hairdresser or this and this. I was like, I don't know how you all find each other, but it's yeah, you find their pockets and of people, and yeah, it's really interesting.
Similar to like we had a lot of family friends. Like my mom and dad, they had like people who they like were their neighbors in Jamaica, or like I don't know, that were just part of their neighborhood in Jamaica. And then like when they moved to the US, it's like, oh, this is our, this is our, like, it's like, oh, like nothing happened. Like, like there haven't been years since they saw each other. It's like, now this is our family friend here in the US. And it's like, sometimes we had family friends who we would call like aunt or something. And we didn't even know that they're not really our aunt or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah. So I totally can relate to that for sure. Yeah. Did you also have family here when you first like moved?
Ooh, I think it was just my dad and mom at first, but then we had his brothers that also moved back, and so they were also in Louisiana with him. I think he had one of his younger brothers was down there and that in Louisiana, and then when I was in high school onward through college, we had another brother or so, and then we had his sister's daughters come and move to California. So there was a lot of immigration, I guess, of people coming into those different areas and pockets, and they also moved eventually to Houston. So we knew them in Louisiana; they were there, and then we were kind of split, and then they kind of came back, and we actually had a lot of my dad's side of the family move to the US. But my mom's side, no one has ever moved from my mom's side. But everyone from my dad's side has some sort of connections or traveled in and out. That's not uncommon too much, but it tends to happen. Once you have someone with family there and they think it's great, and it's like, oh, well, you wanted to come too, come on over, we'll support you or help you get your way down here or whatever it needs to happen.
For sure. And how often do you get to go back and visit, or if at all? Yeah.
Oh, well, I haven't visited in a while. And when we were kids, we visited so much when we were young. Like every summer we'd be out there. And I remember one summer I was there for 2 months and I couldn't do it. I had this old school portable video game system called a Game Gear, which is like ancient technology at this point. But it was a portable video game that uses on AA batteries. And I think I went through thousands of batteries in 2 months of just playing that console because I had nothing to do. Because remember, when you traveled back in those days, the reason you travel was to go visit and see the sights and the sounds and restaurants and people and family. As a kid, you can't go to a bar or go to a nice restaurant by yourself. You don't know anybody there. You know your cousins, but they're all so much older, and you were just kind of locked in the house while your parents were just there reliving 2 months of like their old school life, right? What they grew up with and they remember. And it was obviously enjoyable for them, but for the kids, they were like, I don't know what to do. I go back to my normal school and I have nothing to talk about. I've just been stuck here. But I mean, there were other times it was very good. We went for weddings, and weddings were insanely amazing and beautiful down there. And food was always amazing and great. And so it was also nice to be in the cultural heritage. And it was actually very good practice when I was a kid to keep reinforcing the language. So I grew up, speaking both Hindi and English. And with my dad, I've always spoken English, and my mom, it's always been Hindi. I don't know if that was by design or not, but it tends to be that the more formal respect you want to give, it was English. Like that's the formal, consistent, well understood language. You use that. If I'm speaking in Hindi, it's a very informal, very fast spoken, very loose, very whatever kind of conversation. And I had that with my mom, who I'm closer with, right? And that's always been there. Even today, I still switch between languages or context switch accordingly between them. But I will say after the high school and those earlier and smaller, once you get to high school age, you kind of didn't go back. You're like, well, I want to go spend time with my friends. I want to go do this. I'm in college. I want to go travel with other people. So I didn't go as much. I did have an ex-girlfriend that was there. So I traveled there a few more years and then maybe one other once or twice, but I haven't been back in a while, to be honest. And I have lots of friends who beg me like, oh, I'd love to go India and go back there. I'm like, nah, I'm okay. I'm like, it's all right. I'm like, yeah, it's all right. It's fine. I mean, there's lots of things. The other thing that you may have also experienced with your family members is once they were here enough in a certain country, going back isn't the same. And this happens whether you're in the same country forever or you're just visiting back home. They're like, the first question is like, this doesn't feel like the same place. Like everything has changed. Everything has changed so much and people don't dress the same. So I'm like, it's not you and it's not the country. It's the fact that life has moved on in time, right? Mm-hmm. Cultures change, fashions change, dialect changes. Like you just are going to miss it. And even people who've lived in the US, you go through your teens and your 20s and your 30s and your 40s. And by the time you're in your 30s, 40s, you're like, wait, I'm no longer the cool person. Everyone else there's like 2 layers below me that are like all the current up and coming generations. And you realize you're no longer the generation, right? Because all through elementary, middle school, high school, and even into college, you're like the generation. Usually, like you're the one that everyone's like up and coming and things are all about, and you're the one that gets it and that gets lost. And when you talk to your parents who are from a different culture and they go back to visit home and they see that happen in an instant, it messes with them a little bit if they haven't been back or they are consistently going back. But it's a combination of being older and things moving on and also some of that nostalgia.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it sounds like, you visited or you traveled a lot when you were younger. So you still kind of sound like you have that tie, you've had a lot of that experiences and stuff. And so you actually kind of got into a question that we typically ask, which is like, about the language. And I don't know if this is hyperbole or not, but I've heard that India has like hundreds of languages. I don't know, languages or dialects or dialects.
Yes, yeah. But no, it's very true. And it's because you could go 20 feet and someone will speak it. This is hyperbole. You can go 20 feet and someone will speak a different language. But there'll be a huge mix of it. But it's interesting because then if you go to Europe and you go like Germany or France or Switzerland, and like there's known national languages and things in general, and you might speak multiple languages. There might be some blending in dialects, and because you're close partners with one of the other countries, and your languages tend to blend in terms of usage and things, and language expands and grows and changes. That's just part of language. But in India, because everything's so culturally tied to your location, it's weird that where you were born and where you live has so much impact on what cultural and religious practices you take, what religion you may be, what your physical appearances might end up being because you were born in that area, because of who lives there and how tight that community is. Like everything can be so distinctly thing by where are you from, right? That question, where are you from, is so paramount and is almost in a unfortunate toxic way for India because of things that happened in the past with the caste system and other things. And I will be honest, I've never liked that question, because when it's asked from people who are from India, and not Indian Americans who are born here, but just people from India, it is a very pointed question of how do I evaluate you and how should I rank you in my mental caste system that I have, that I've been trained on. And it is very, very, unfortunately, very demeaning and very things you have no control about, but it is very much like that. So your language, if you go and speak to someone in the Australian language, they can pick up the dialect. They say, oh, you're probably from so-and-so. And, all those guys, they just drink a lot, or those people, they're real lazy. Like, it's just always negative stereotype. No one's like, wow, those people are the sweetest, most wonderful people ever. If you see them, they're great. Like, you don't ever hear positive, I hate to say stereotypes and things. It's always like a negative thing. And while stereotypes always come from some truth or some broad sense, it really comes down back to the human psyche of saying, I need to classify. It's classification. And that is a innate, built-in, instinctive response to how we survive as any creature, and all creatures. We will become better educated and intelligent to know that is not, while that is the first internal response, we then go to the next question of, yes, I have some understanding of the stereotypes and I know things about them. What can I now validate, and how can I actually know who this person is? Because this is an individual, not a group, not a stereotype, not a classification of a group. And I go beyond that question of where are you from and who are you?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's funny. You kind of covered that, because that's another question we typically have on our list is like, yeah, do you get asked that? Where are you from? And then how do you respond? But it sounds like almost it kind of depends on who asked you that. Because like you're saying, if it's like a person from India asking you that, there's usually this connotation trying to like maybe size you up or understand. But like, yeah, I guess if somebody from like America asks you that, is that a different response, or does
yes, it is. And I get it all the time too. And it's a totally different irk or irritation. But like, and I mean, I say this, I say it's irritation, but I think well, I'll come back to this part, but being questioned on who you are or what you are is always so demeaning and feels like you're less worth. It always makes you feel self-worth less. Anytime someone asks you, like, where are you from? It feels like a question of, why do you need to know? what does that matter? Right? You always want to question, like, why does it matter? Like, I'm not saying that someone, if you're traveling, it's a different thing. If you're traveling across the country, like, hey, where are you from? Like, oh, I'm from Texas. I'm totally fine. Like, except the question, you never feel like there's this burden of like, I need to qualify you in some way or quantify everything about you. But when I was growing up in, Houston and stuff like that, or any other place, and it doesn't matter who it was, and someone that was not ethnically Indian of origin or background, or maybe Pakistani or whatever it might be, or that in that area, usually it was a question like, I don't know what to call you or understand about you. I'm trying to understand a little bit about what you are, where you come from. And then they layer it, depending on who they are, what their intentions are, they could layer in the stereotypes or expectations, or they could move on to just say, oh, well, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. I want to learn about that culture. And then some people just didn't really matter. They're just like, who are you? What are you? What do I know about you? I don't really know anything else. Right. Because who wants to, because you're like, 10 years old, the last thing you want is a history lesson, someone's like demographic. I'm like, I just want to play, like, see if you want to get some lunch together, or like maybe go play some games. I don't really need to know the whole history. But what are you, especially when I get asked from other people, they're from also other Asian cultures, like from Asia or from other, sometimes in, even if they're different ethnicities from the US coming in, again, they'll say the question incorrectly, like, where are you from? I'm like, I'm from Austin. I'm like, no. Where are you from? I'm like, well, I mean, I'm from the east side of, West Austin, I guess, or maybe I'm from Texas. I'm like, well, no, where's your family from? Oh, okay. Well, they're from Houston. And I do this game with them constantly because I know what they were asking, but I love to mess with them. And I would just irk because you're asking her really you're asking a question that can come off very inappropriate or rude, even if you don't know, because you're targeting a very specific thing rather than just saying like, oh, tell me more about your background or history or what culture or ethnicity. Really, the question is like, what's your ethnicity, right? But no one says that. People ask, like, where are you from? And then they'll be like, oh, well, my parents are from Houston. I'm like, okay, well, no, where did they come from? Well, they came from the ground, because that's where all things come from. And then you just keep messing with them, and like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, what language do they speak? Do they speak Hindu? I'm like, no, that's a religion. Hindi is the language you're looking for, but that's not even the correct one. Like, it could be this language or 8,000 different languages. Like, what do you want to know? Right? What do you try to get to? And the question they hate, and eventually they get tired. And this is me if I'm just having a bad day. I just really want to mess with someone, but but I know with them, but eventually I'll be like, yes, I'm Indian. Congratulations. You figured me out. I'm Indian. You couldn't tell what I was. Apparently this was super important, but here you go. But like, did it really matter? Because again, there's nicer ways to ask that question of somebody. Like, hey, what's your ethnicity? And sometimes, especially nowadays, there's such a multi-ethnicity background. I would feel even worse for someone that's multi-ethnic. Like, well, my parents are Indian, and my mom is Indian, but my dad's from like Poland. And like, what do I tell you? What do I put on the form of what your ethnicity is? Like, do I just say Asian? Do I say multi-race? Like, it gets more and more weird, right? Especially than it had been with like very clear, I guess, segmentation that people want to have. But again, is this person wrong for asking the question? Generally, no. And again, most people don't have such bad intent. They're not having negative, bad intentions around it. But some people do. And some people also want to know a very specific thing, because again, that lets them know how they should approach you. It's that instinctive response of, I need to know what stereotypes to apply. And growing up in Texas, and being slightly lighter skinned than than some Indians that might be from a different area or whatnot, but just barely, I get mistaken for being Hispanic constantly. And so I have the fun thing of being mistaken to whatever I will say general brown person might be of the area. So I just came back from Costa Rica. Everyone thought I was Costa Rican 100%. Like, absolutely, you're Costa Rican. I went to Europe. I was in France. People thought I was French because black hair, slightly tan skin. That's French, like 100%. And like, nope, not French, but I speak French. I could talk to you. And they're like, yeah, you must be French, because people kept talking to me in French. They kept thinking it was a French person. Then I go to Italy. Everyone's like, Italian, right? I look Italian. Oh, absolutely. Dark brown hair, hairy chest, arms, like tan skin. Like, you're 100% Italian. Absolutely. Because who they are used to seeing as people from India is actually different. A lot of Indians that they see in Europe or those areas are from a different, sometimes area or perspective of India. And they have, unfortunately, sometimes they're a lot of the lower class, and they're escaping and immigrating, which is not uncommon, right? Like, how many times do you go to Mexico and see, well, the richest people here are just floundering to the US? Like, yeah, they're probably buying houses, but you're not going to see them. They're not working at 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 different places that you might see them that you might have unfortunately, stereotypical expectations of, right?
Mhm.
And so I did not match their description of what an Indian person was. And so they had to assume I was something else in all these places. Even in Costa Rica, as I found a month ago, a ton of Indian people have started traveling there, and I don't look like them. And so they think I'm Costa Rican because I'm not the type of Indian that comes. So this mixed unknown identity problem
Mhm.
comes into play a lot by purely your physical appearance, regardless of that. And then sometimes it could be the problem of, well, who am I? Do I fit in anywhere? And you start to question yourself. And I'm sure you have some questions about that too, which I'll answer. But you really start to have this self-identity problem.
Yeah.
I don't know what I am. I don't know who I am or where I belong.
Yeah.
And then I get questioned of what I'm supposed to be by everybody. Like, what are you? And you just get into like, I'm tired. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who would you like me to be?
I'm tired. Yes. So yeah, I totally can relate, and yeah, I used to get asked that more when I was growing up, and it used to, because we like to just see what. So some guests are like, I don't mind, and some people are like, yeah, it bothers me, and it used to bother me a lot when I was younger, but not so much now anymore. But like, it sounds more like it's you want them to just kind of like get to the gist, right? Like, what do you really want to know? Like they're trying to ask it, but not really. Kind of.
Yeah, they're playing games. They're being shy about, instead of being just direct. Like, what would you actually like to know? And saying, I need to know your ethnicity so I know how to judge you. And that second half may not need to be there, but at some point they need to know the ethnicity because something about them needs to understand to reconcile. But it's like kind of like if you saw a fruit, you're like, well, I need what kind of fruit is it? I need to know if it's a fruit, is it really fruit? What if it's a vegetable? What if it's a piece of meat? I don't know what it is, right?
Mhm.
Again, it's this classification thing.
I see.
And while you're all humans and you're all people, and you can judge someone's like, well, you might be able to guess their age or, maybe some other things about them. But I think it comes from an instinctive threat response, right? We understand and evaluate threats constantly because it's part of our survival instinct. And so we're always wanting to know, what is that? And then, is that good or bad? Or is this okay? Or is it fine? Or do you need to find more information? Now, depending on how you've grown up, some people have zero threat. They're like, everyone's always been my friend. I've never had a bad experience in my life. It's like a dog. My dog think everyone's his best friend. No one's an enemy. My other dog, who was abandoned and like was running around San Antonio, was like, ooh, I don't know about that dog. I don't feel it. Like I got attacked by this type of dog. I don't want to do that. Or I don't know about this
Yeah.
person. And like, there's these trauma responses. And so
I
right
see.
or wrong, you can't control what people have experienced, unfortunately, about something you had no impact to, but someone might have had, unfortunately, a bad experience with someone of your ethnicity or background or type or even gender or whatever it may be. And you can't control that. You can only be the best person you are and being accommodating and being like, I probably can't be friends with them because they seem to be fearful of me. Maybe this is not going to work out. Or we're best friends because we just don't care and it's never really been a thing, but you never know.
Very interesting. So this has been so interesting to hear, I guess, how they answer differently to that. So yeah, that's very cool.
I just wanted to go back to that point of that you brought up about how like people are becoming so much more mixed, and multiracial. And I mean, we've seen that in our own lives, is that we are Jamaican, but our mother is Chinese Jamaican. So we're like this weird mix. And also my dad has some mixture in his background as well, even though he doesn't look it as much as my mother does. So yeah, so it's that whole thing of like not knowing what box to choose is something that we've discussed before. And yeah, and that's totally real and relatable. And I think, like you said, a lot more people, especially in recent years, can relate to that because there has been, just with globalization, more mixture and more like really crazy mixture that you wouldn't even
Oh
think
yeah.
of. Yeah. So yeah, that's totally true. But I want to ask you about, because you said also that when you go to different countries, a lot of people don't view you as what they think of as an Indian person
Mhm.
should look like. So when you go to India, do people view you as an Indian person, or are they like
Oh man, no, that actually was more of a traumatic thing for me, and that caused that self-worth issue. So
Mm.
growing up, I would always get the "Who are you?" or "What are you?" and I was never considered an American by some people because I was like, "Well, you're not white, so you can't be an American." I'm like, do you know how long Chinese people have been in the U.S. or Black people or anybody else? Like, what are you talking about? There's been Indians and other cultures for so long, but in their world, if you weren't a certain type of culture or like part of their culture they knew, you couldn't have been from here because that's not what they see on TV or movies or other things, or even in their hometown or the people they spent time with. And I'll come back to that because it's a little bit more detailed on that one. But if that was the case that always made me feel like I didn't belong. But I had better success with those. Still, I could have better success and intermingle. However, the Indian Americans that were like me, we always felt like, well, we didn't quite belong in that culture because we were Indian, but we weren't quite Americans, even though we were born here. So we were American, but our parents were first gen. And so we still had some resistance of not being culturally mixed in. I go to India, absolutely every single person knows I'm not from there, right? 100%. I don't belong there either because they know from my accent and my dress and where I'm from that I'm clearly a vacation Indian, that's there. And, there's always this unfortunate joke, that had been around since the 90s or probably even longer. I don't know, maybe longer than that, but being fresh off the boat, right? Being a fresh immigrant was always like the negative stitch we said to anyone who came in that wasn't born here. If you're born here, you were like a little higher stature because you could claim closer to being part of the American culture or being part of that. And that could separate you from the weird people that might be made fun of, unfortunately, or being picked on or being bullied or whatever it might be. Well, those people got so frustrated too, and they came up with their own names and they had their own things like, oh, well, you're just a silly American-born Indian, which is called ABCD. And you probably heard that term. It is common.
Oh, no.
There's even movies on it. It's a joke.
Oh.
But that was the counter slur to people who were born in America and that they were Indians, but they were confused because they were born in America. They just don't understand the history of the culture. They don't know anything about what's real India and the real things because they just not from here. They're not the real part of us. Right? They're a little bit different. It was the counterculture. So when you go over there, everyone thinks you're that. Everyone knows you're not the same. And so you don't belong to either culture. You're not Indian enough for the Indian people because you weren't born there. And you're not American for the American people, even though you were, because you just don't look like them sometimes, or you didn't have the right culture. And what I have seen change is that back when I grew up, way, way back in the day, before growing up, is while those cultures were people that might have been unknown to Indian people or have seen them, because maybe their family friends just never had an Indian friend. They just didn't have anybody. They weren't neighbors with them. They weren't this or that. Like there just wasn't a blending. I went to school in Houston where everyone blended because it was such a large public school and there's so many people in those areas that you had a blend of almost every race possible. And they all blended and you had to interact and you had to find a community and you had to find people. And it was more often than not that you blended with multiple people of multiple races because that's what was there. There wasn't we're not X, Y, or Z. And therefore we stuck together and this stuck together. Like you were more willing to open because you kind of learned you had to. You weren't always gonna be friends with every single Filipino friend that was in my high school, or every single African-American or Black person that was there, or every single Indian person that was there. You'd have different cliques, just like anybody else, but you learn to adapt to that nature. And what I've seen over time is as I've gotten older, and which is nice to know, is I've seen more and more people blended and having more of those relationships with other diversities of any kind of diversity. And as that has changed over the last 10, 20, 30 years, it's very apparent that more and more people have friends from different diversities, and that opens their mindset and it becomes more common. And I would say in the last 10 years, for those who are really at the final end of the millennials and the Zoomers coming up, right? Like they have absolutely no concern of idea about like race or mix or anything. Like they're so far beyond that. Like that's not even a thing that can be clicked. They're all into other things that we're still struggling with as millennials and even previous generations of understanding and acceptance, right? Like the movement has gone and people are moving forward. And that means the blending has happened of more acceptance across the board, and race and things like that, and ethnicity of where are you from. I never get that asked that from anyone that's below the age of 30, maybe 25. Anyone below the age of 25, no one's ever asked me, where are you from? They don't care. They never asked. It's just like, it's not important. Why would it be important? What does it matter? You ask people who are 40 and up, or 30 and up, or 35 and up, you might still hear it, but definitely 40 and up for sure. People will ask, where are you from? Where have you been from? Because it's so common in their cultural things. Ask that question because they're not sure. So I think, anyway, that's my long answer to your question to that. But I think it's something I've seen.
And kind of keeping on this theme of like mixtures of cultures, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, your mother and father are from completely different parts of India.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, is that common at all? I feel like from what I've kind of heard about, marriages in India, a lot of times you want it to kind of stay within the
Yes,
same
yeah.
caste, like you said, and that kind of thing. So
That was kind of the bane of my existence, trying to date other Indian women most of my early life in college. Like it was, I wish I could say I was joking, but it really was, but it was hard, but you're right. My parents meeting that were from different cultural sides, like is not, I wouldn't say it was uncommon. Like it happens for sure, but like, it wasn't like a huge, oh my God, someone from a different state married. And it's like saying someone from Texas married someone from Oklahoma. Like what? Why is that a big deal? Who cares? But there's such a cultural difference, you know what I mean? Like up around it. So, and their families, my mom and my dad's family is like, they know each other and exist, but they're not like best buds or anything like that. And they have different cultural things. And they all talk crap about each other for different reasons because they're from so-and-so and this from this. And my mom will talk crap about like, oh yeah, your dad's family, they're XYZ stereotype slur. I don't even know if I can say it or pronounce it correctly, but like she'll say some Indian stereotypal slur. I'm like, they're all like this and they're all really blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, mom, like, is the same okay? I feel like you're saying something kind of racist or stereotypical. It's obviously we're the same race, but like, I don't know, something seems wrong here. I don't know if that's appropriate, but like, here we go, right? Like, absolutely. They have their still tension. They have their still classification and like understanding of how they want to generalize the population, because the truth is humans are very, very, very bad at trying to remember how every individual works. There's just too much to remember and understand. So we're very good at just saying, well, in general, this group and this classification or this whatever behaves like this. And we can accept that much. It's also why you max out about 100, 150 people, I think, and they said organizations of how many people you really get to know really well. So around 100, 150 people you can be close with, right? It's the general rule. Beyond that, you're just not going to have time to worry about every single person's nuances and things like that in between. And I think the same thing happens when you think about all the variety and the mixtures and the cultures and the dialects. You just say, nope, this group, just like that. And you make a sly little joke. And my mom will say that all the time. Whenever she was mad at my dad, to be fair, she'd just make this comment or she'd say something or whatever. And it was, they go back and forth, and my dad would make fun of my mom because of her background and whatever. And it was endearing, but it was also like kind of funny and also like, ooh, I don't know if that's appropriate anymore to do these things, but like, it's okay. So I think, yeah, it was a little strange growing up, but you're right with marriages. And when I was trying to date, the amount of questions I would get like, well, where's your family from? Because that was the defining factor. If your family, I had a lot of Gujarati friends growing up in Houston, and there's a big population of that there. And a lot of Gujarati people marry people from Gujarat because they try to keep that community keep growing and blowing it. And they marry from Gujarati to Gujarati, and marrying a non-Gujarati to another Punjabi. Ooh, that's a little questionable because, our marriage cultures are totally different. And even if you're in Gujarat, there could be lots of variants of like how that family has done it for years and traditions. And this family lives 200 feet away is a totally different tradition, and they've done that for years. And they've got to come to agree of how the marriage is going to happen. Right. And like what needs to be. So when you have this cross culture, it's almost like marrying another religion, right? Like you're almost marrying another religion because your customs are different. And so here's where it's interesting. Well, you might see people say, we're both the same religion, right? We're both, I'll pick on Hinduism. We're both Hindu. Cool. Yeah, but your family practices it so differently than my family practices it. So it's almost like sects or denominations, like in Christianity. Like we practice it. Yeah, we're the same religion, kind of, sort of, but we have so many different customs that are not from religious reasons, but purely from geographical reasons and the culture that has evolved there around that splits of how it keeps us separated, or keeps us, I guess, not separated, but also something unique, right, of what we need to kind of value. And so again, those things can get combined and build together and do whatever, but it depends if you want to, right? If that doesn't really matter to you, and obviously my parents didn't care, and people still do this today, then it's fine. And other people are absolutely super strict, like, sorry, I can't. My parents said, you weren't born at 12:04 on the midnight of this day. And it didn't have, I'm not even joking. That was a real thing that happened. People were like, oh yeah. My mom was like, yeah, what time of day were you born? And you read this thing and this astrological sign and this thing. Wow. Astrology is huge in Indian culture, about where you were, and then what caste were you, and then was this thing and that thing, and who's your family, was your dad this, and what is your job, and like blah 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 blah. I just got so tired of it.
Yeah.
And it was just so frustrating. After a while, I just I'm done. I'm moving on. And it was always a challenge. And also, Indian culture is a lot of, like most Asian cultures, I think too, have a lot of expectations on the broader community and reputation. or family reputation than the individual. Whereas in America, we're all about the individual. And in Asian culture, it's very more about the family. And I think also in other places as well, right? And so if you weren't the right level or expectation that your families were being married, because that's what was really happening, your families were being combined, not just you, but your families were being combined. Sometimes it didn't work. Even if you loved each other or things were, you wanted to be together, that just didn't happen. And it's unfortunate. And I think some of that softened, to be honest. I think a lot of things modernized. People kind of got over some of that, but some of it's not. And again, because it depends on how culturally strict you want to be and how your family has raised you and what your expectations are. And that's neither right nor wrong. I think it just depends if you accept that or not. And you could be born in a very strict form and go opposite, or you could be very not strict and people go the other way, right? It happens all the time. People can become more whichever way they want to be, depending on what they think they need.
Wow, that's so interesting to me. How like geographically they could be fairly close to each other, but it's so different traditions and things. So that's really, really interesting. So we saw, and I don't know if you've seen this movie, and there was this, it's kind of like a documentary thing we watched on from Amazon Prime. It was called like Meet the Patels. And it was this guy talking about, he was trying to date an Indian American guy, and he was a Patel, and he was talking about how the Patel like name and what that represents. And there was this like, I think he was like in his 30s. I don't know what age he was, but his parents were like, when are you going to get married? Like, when are you going to, all these kind of things, that you get asked after a certain age and all this stuff. And so he agreed to they were like, let us do this. What's the database thing called? Biodata.
Oh, Biodata. Yeah. Biodata is the term. Yes, unfortunately.
Okay.
Biodata.
And I was just so amazed. I was like, there's no way this is a thing. I was like, this is, it really, okay. So that's my question. Is it like, it just was basically a documentary on his life. And then he's letting his parents do that for him for like a year and a half or something like that. And he ended up not, I think, finding anybody. But I just was curious. Like, I almost didn't believe it. Like,
there's webs. Go to IndianMatrimony.com and any Indian dating website. They all say, "Can I have your biodata?" And it is a joke. Like, it's a meme. Because for anyone here, like saying, when everyone says biodata, like we say it in the, like, I have to say, like in a very stereotypical way, like to help put the accents on the word to make it sound like someone from there would say it. Again, out of the humor and jest, right? Like, not to be mean, but it's like, oh, do you have your biodata? And we're like, this has been there since I was in high school, like forever. It is a thing. It is a full historical, like almost like your entire family background and like,
wow.
Like, who's your family? What do they do? What's their job? What family? Where were they born? Where was this? Where were you born? What is your caste? What's your, like, everything about you and your family to judge whether or not you've got the right attributes that qualify to meet the bar for our daughter or son to marry you, right? Like, I need your full biodata to make sure all the things align and all the things are here and all the things look good. Cause like, well, their family is from the right area, but they practice this religion now. Okay, well, they're the right religion and they're the right caste and they're born in the right area, but they were born in the wrong time. So the astrological signs aren't going to match up. The Bible is bad. Gosh. You're going to have a horrible marriage. They'll get divorced. Like all these things about superstition. My mom is, by the way, super superstitious. So I have some of that from her. And Indian culture, in India, superstition is super big. Like super, super big. So this biodata is like your qualification sheet. It is like going to a job interview times 10, because it is like things you have no control over are being judged for how you were born and what you were born into, which I think most people disagree. Is like, you shouldn't be judged on something you weren't born into, that had no control over. But we obviously, everyone does this and everyone has some of it, and right or wrong, it's part of that. And this was this qualification scheme of getting that. So it is a very real thing. It sucks. It's also why I didn't get to date certain women, because I remember a friend I was in college. She's like, "Oh, I have a girl. She might be interested, single, available. But like, what caste are you for your family?" I'm like, I don't know. I never asked that. I don't know what that is. I never thought about it. It's never come up. I've never had a girl ask me that, from even if they were Indian, or if I told them, like, ask me what my caste was, if that was a blocker. They asked me if I was Indian, like, were you Hindu or were you kind of religious or not, or maybe something like that. But I'm like, yeah, whatever. Whatever you want. Like, sure. And the caste that had never come up. And then I have to go ask my mom, like, "Mom, what's your caste?" Like, okay. I'm like, all right, it's this one. And then I get it. And I told her, I'm like, "Well, I'm this." And she's like, "Oh, that's not." They won't do that, because it would divulge the quality or the casting, because they would be going down one. I think they were the top caste, which are Brahmins, and we were just underneath, and that wasn't enough. Like, that was like, oh no, it's got to be Brahmin to Brahmin, because religiously that means you are here, and spiritually that's that qualification. So going down means you're going some whatever. You're not the right thing. Obviously, people still marry intercaste, but it's such a weird thing, and not looked good upon. But like, yeah, it was such a headache. And honestly, I'll be honest, I kind of stopped dating any women after that. After like 20 years, 25 years of dealing with this, I was like, you know what? I'm tired of having to keep proving myself that I'm good enough to be acceptable to date. Because funny enough, and this is actually might be related. So I told you I'm in tech, right? So back when I was dating the olden days, because again, I feel like I'm ancient now.
You're not Anuj.
I know I'm not. But I always feel like I'm ancient. I hang around like 25-year-olds and 30-year-olds all the time. So I feel like I'm young at heart. And so what happens was like I was not good enough because the number one job profession back in 2000, 2010 for a long in that time period had always been doctor. Like if you were a doctor, you were like God. You were the best option because it was guaranteed money. It was super respected in the community of all communities of Indian people. Like you had to be a doctor. Being a doctor was the best profession. It didn't matter if you made $1 a day or $1 million a month. Like it didn't care. It wasn't about the money. Though the money was always the thing. It was just the fact that you had this culturally accepted that even the most simplest of people from all levels, because you could say, my son's a doctor, my daughter's a doctor. Everyone would accept this. And everyone would recognize how amazing and such a great career and a good career that was to help other people and save lives. And like this was the purest, best thing. And also the money really mattered. It was really cool. And like that was really important. And financial security and safety. And so being a doctor was always a profession. My parents were so upset. Even when I graduated college with a computer science degree, after I graduated, like 2 days later, like, you know, if you still want to be a doctor, and like, I'm like, I just graduated. I just got a degree. And like, yeah, but what are you going to do with this computer science thing? I was this computer stuff. Who knows? I was like, you could try to be a doctor and maybe, that could bring, could get you married and like, it might be a better profession. I'm like, I'm not going to be a doctor. I'm sorry. I'm just good with these computer things that I don't know. I think they're going to be popular later one day. Maybe we'll see. I guess I'll just keep fixing them. And then watching over the years, like watching the 2000, all the tech booms and all the explosions. And like today, being in tech is like the godsend. I mean, I don't know if it's still the highest, but I would say it's definitely, if not the highest, probably the second highest. Being in tech is like so well respected of making money in a financially stable job, and so well that like it's being in tech is now acceptable. Working in tech is acceptable. You don't have to be a doctor if you work in tech. It's a good. But I got turned down from a lot of friends that was interested in or like looking to date or other people because I was a computer scientist. So like that's not a job. That's not going to make any money. You're not a doctor. Like I had a friend, a really good friend of mine. She's like, well, my parents, and this is real. She's like, well, my parents said first we go look for a doctor. And if we can't find any doctors, then we'll go to lawyers. And if we can't find any lawyers, then we'll go to this, and then we'll go to this, and then like fourth or fifth down, like we might accept an engineer. Like we might accept engineering. I'm like, cool. I'm so far from dating you. This sucks. And I was like, oh no, I'm never going to make it. I'm just not anywhere near anything. But like, anyway, that is a very real thing. Like I said, so biodata and history, it's, does it still matter today? Yes, it does. It's still so huge part. But am I going to date someone as an Indian American and worry about someone with the biodata? No. Do I know people who are, especially women, I'll say this, who are much closer to generally their parents and want to meet their parents' expectations more than guys. I'll say guys generally don't care as much, but the women generally care much more about doing what's right with their parents, what really want to make them happy. And I'm like, why? Who cares? You're going to die anyway. I should say, do your thing. I'm a very independent person, but they do, and then they will try to find the expectations that make them think they're going to have like a good life and make sure the families come together because they are very close, right? So it makes sense.
Wow. There are so many like venues I could go down based on what you said, but like, first of all, thank you for debunking that. Well, I mean, I figured it was true. Like it seemed like a real documentary and everything. I just almost couldn't believe it because I was like, wow, that's kind of, on one hand, I was like, that's kind of interesting that like your parents have like, there's like this huge database of things, but like, I totally understand now why you feel so strongly, I think, about not liking getting asked the question of like, where are you from? Because I feel like throughout so many different aspects of cultures, like you are constantly being like assessed, right? Whether it's so that totally, like now that you've explained, like it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the assessing really hurts. If you want to watch another, not a documentary, but that's also very accurately funny, is go on Netflix and watch Never Have I Ever. It is very close to wondering Never Have I Ever. It's about an Indian girl that's growing up with an Indian culture family in the US and the dynamics of being an Indian American in the US while dealing with very culturally parents, right? And it is very accurate and it is very funny. and it is a very well done job. My ex-girlfriend was watching it to learn more about me. And I'm like, yeah, this is legit. I'm not even gonna lie. Like a lot of this stuff is pretty there, and it's very funny, and it's a great show. I think the new season just came out.
Okay.
I have no ties with the show, so I'm not promoting it, but I'm just letting you know it's a never have I ever. Watch it on Netflix.
I'm writing it down.
Great if you want to watch more about Indian culture, and it actually also overlays with just Asian culture. So not just South Asian, but also Asian. It's a very similar family dynamic.
Just like staying on the topic of like films, I mean, this is a much lighter film that doesn't delve as deeply into these topics, but do you remember, Alyssa, we watched a movie on Netflix called Wedding Season?
Yes.
And it was, it was a similar kind of general topic of this girl's turning 30 or something, and her parents want her to get married. And so they like, her mom kind of like writes her biodata for her and like makes up some stuff. And then like she ends up being with this guy who also kind of made up stuff. And it was
that was more of a not satire, but a comedy version.
Yeah, it's like more of like a light romantic comedy, but it kind of touched on similar themes of how important like appearances are, and like, you know, because it ended up being that they were both kind of lying, but the guy especially was lying about who he was, or his biodata.
You mean he wasn't a 6'3" tall guy on his Bumble profile? I mean, it's funny how that also relates to people online dating today, which is a whole separate topic. But if you think about it, everyone has a little bit of fake biological data because we're being judged and assessed on things that we have, again, no control over a lot of times. But, you know, you get a photo and you get your biodata on Bumble or Tinder, and this is it. Now, obviously, the Indian version is so in depth, but it's kind of like going on a competition. And you're like, how do I beat this test? Because if I don't meet this test, I don't get in. So I don't fib or lie, I'm not going to get there. And I remember when my parents signed up me for these Indian matrimonial sites, and my dad put in my diary. I'm like, Dad, why did you put in this? Like, you misspelled half the words. It makes me look like I don't know what I'm doing. Like, he just was horrible. He had his very poor communication skills on writing, unfortunately in English. But like, he was just having a horrible in the biodata. I'm like, well, their parents are going to read it. And it was always funny because you knew the girls, it wasn't the girls whose profile was up there, it was the parents. The parents were dating each other, right? The parents were looking at the biodatas and checking each other, not the people. We never had no idea until they said, look, here's a picture. We want you to talk to this girl. Go say hi. And that was it. Like, that's as far as we get to go.
So fast. Like you said, there's so many different avenues we could go in.
But we won't keep you here forever. But
it's all right. I can keep answering questions as long as you want. But this has been fun for me too. And I like I said, I have a lot of perspectives about that concept of why we ask the question, where are you from, and the human psychology around it, right around it. And I think it very deeply, it still is about the fact of we innately need to know how to assess people so we can classify and then judge how that reflects to our past experiences and know how to approach good or bad, right or wrong. And I think that the real choice for humanity is eventually, like all people, is to take that breath and say, I'm making judgments and assessments, and that's okay. And we don't have to be like, don't ever make a stereotype. Don't ever think that they're true. I think that's unrealistic and not really how our brains or bodies work. I think the thing is accepting that, yes, I'm going to have this instinctual response. Now let me move beyond that, because instincts isn't how we grow or show our intelligence. You know, as a society, I might be hungry. That doesn't mean I stick my hand into the donut case at Krispy Kreme and steal the donut and eat it because, like, well, I was hungry. Like, some people do that, but that's not really right. I'm like, hey, I should probably pay for that. I should think about these things and like have some thought process about what I would like to do to get to this donut. But I think with people, we haven't really given them the tools to think about that either. We just assume it happens naturally. And I think those that are growing up in a culture that is where they are not the majority and they have more diversity to deal with, they are more prone to being pushed to figure out how to handle and approach the pressure and the burden that comes on top of them, but also then how to then reflect and then reach out to others in a more amicable way, right? Which is why you'll see more smaller diversity groups, easier for them to interact because they go through similar journeys really through that process.
Very interesting. Yeah, there's so many ways I could go there, but I've kind of gotten to that before. Like, yeah, how like I didn't like the question before, but it doesn't bother me so much. Actually, it doesn't really bother me that much now. I think it's just curiosity. But yeah, but it caused me a lot of cultural and identity issues growing up because I was like, I'm Alyssa. What do you mean? Like, I realized like, okay, what they mean is like, yeah, how do you look? And my mom is a lot fairer than me, and so people would ask, are you adopted? What is? And I was like, why are people? And then you realize at a very young age, the color of my skin or how I am perceived is a very big deal, and like that and so that makes you realize like, oh, okay, like, you know. And so yeah, so I totally get it. Like, it doesn't bother me that much anymore, but I totally understand why it would as well. And I try to be, if I am, sometimes I am curious about somebody I see, like ask it in a very just like direct way, like, hey, like, like I can tell by your name, like this, but like just, and I don't know. I don't know how you feel about that, but like I try to just be more, not beat around the bush about it, and just be like, hey, like how do you, I'm just curious, like as a fellow child of immigrants, like are your parents from a different country as well, or
They could be, but you may not know that. But like growing up in Texas, if you weren't quote unquote light skinned or white, you were just assumed to be from somewhere else. I'm like, again, people have been that are not white skinned here for like generations. Mexico's like 2 feet away, right? Like then those people are here that have been there for generations upon generations upon generations. Like, well, what do you think that someone would, if a different skin would just have to be from somewhere else? And again, it's their perception, whether right or wrong or how it happened through influences, not seeing or being pushed into diversity or knowing that those people exist and putting them in the shadows makes it feel like those people aren't there, and you start to question, where could you have come from?
Right.
Why are you here? You're intruding in this space that I know, this boundary, and now you're something that's different. And I don't know what that is or why. And it's also why I think, there's always been this big push in culture and media to get more ethnic diversities in those media. And there's been a big push with Asian films and Korean films and now Indian people, but you never really saw Asian or South Asian actors, right? Very rarely. It was always been there. And there's a lot of contentions about people being swapped out for certain characters and being whitewashed, I think, or basically swapped in and things like that. I'm like, why would you not get an ethnically correct character to play that character? And there's all these things around that. But even if you didn't have all that, to not show that a real workspace has different cultures and people, and it isn't showing reality. Right. Now, again, their reality might have been different, and that might have been accurate. But in most places that are working in certain fields or industries, it is ethnically diverse. And so I love the show Silicon Valley because it shows an actual accurate verification of what a real tech company would look like with the right diversities, and other shows and things that had the same thing. And I think as more and more of that came, people's understanding of people exist and there are these things has changed, right? And that's definitely changed for this generation that's coming up. But I think that's a positive feedback that is slowly eroding the question of where are you from, and instead, who are you?
Yeah, I see that. I understand the differences that you're talking about. Yeah, and I think you're right. Like I think in media and stuff, I've been seeing more of an influx of Asians being represented in like Shang-Chi, first like real, is that Marvel? Brie? I'm so bad. Yeah, it's Marvel. Yeah, first like Asian Marvel superhero, and I was like hearing him talk, the actor talk about what a profound impact that had on him was so cool, because he talked about how there's not a lot of people who look like him, and so I just thought that was so great that like finally in mainstream movies like that we're seeing them being represented as heroes.
Yeah, it's crazy. And you'd be like, there's obviously been people that are heroes and things like that, but why have we never seen them as much? And it's why I think, unfortunately, I keep getting at the point that people not having their perspectives or have knowing of people like that because maybe they weren't your neighbors when we were growing up. But when you think about certain neighborhoods where there's such a dominance of one majority and the only interaction you have is media, and media portrays a certain race in a certain way, that is what you assume and feel. And if all you hear about certain ethnicities or diversities is X, Y, and Z, or that they're, again, Asians are only smart, they're all good at math, or Indians are only work at gas stations and drive taxis and X, Y, Z, you just hear a stereotype without actually the real human behind it. Right. And you don't have a valid justification of hearing them in other places, then you see this kind of almost bubble and this echo chamber of what to expect if you don't have any real connection. So the best way to break those is to get people to travel, to meet other people, and obviously to meet and interact with other diversities and get other things beyond just one set of media that you might have been having to explore, actually. And that's always been really good because, like I said, traveling was a great way for me to have a real life perspective of how lucky I am that I grew up in a country in America versus some other third world countries or even places in India that I have seen that are totally different. You see real poverty and things like that. And so they do impact you. And I think that impacts, I don't know a good way to get someone to have that. It's to solve like, hey, if you let me just take you to make you travel around the world real quick. So you can just get really open your eyes and see all these amazing things and learn all this stuff. And, but that's a great way to get there. But again, then we have to rely on the next thing, which is social media and internet and everything else. And that's been a double-edged sword, to be honest. It's gone both ways, unfortunately.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
I was just going to say, like, yeah, I've always felt like travel, if everyone in the world could just travel, like it would make the world such a better place because it just opens up your mind and your perspectives, and yeah, it makes
Yeah.
you either, appreciate what you have or sometimes just see a different way of life. And yeah, I
Yeah.
travel is obviously expensive, so it's not like just a matter of being like, you need to travel more. Not everyone can afford that, but if you can, there's nothing better to really help you understand people more and gain more empathy.
Yeah, and that's why we want to like have these conversations is because I feel like it's just a safe space. Like I'm getting to learn more about your culture and your background and your upbringing, and it's just a good, healthy thing. I think it's good to talk about it, and so yeah, and debunk things, and yeah, because there are stereotypes and stuff, and so just kind of just talk about it on a real level, and like you said, who is the person, right? Not just like what are they? Yeah,
And I think for me, like I said, I never claimed to be an expert or the perfect example of all these things, but because I've grown, I think since I've lived long enough to see so much change, I think that's really the thing, seeing the change of how each of those cultures has happened. And that the fact that more people are willing to mix cultures and religions and spaces. And that's been a big positive, right? But um, even just how different communities are interacting. And I'll be honest, in the last 10 years, I've been more distant from my Indian community because I don't really connect with them as much. I don't have anything to stay with them. Do I still have Indian friends here and there? Do I still have that? But nothing like I did when I was growing up that first
Mm.
10, 20 years of life, right? That was the strongest connection to my culture when my parents were young and we were interacting with those families and communities. And then as I grew, and as I didn't get married to someone else of the same culture and community that wanted to keep that bond alive, I got more and more distant. Right. And that isn't a bad thing because it let me do other perspectives and things that I hadn't done. And I still have that core. And so one of the feedbacks I sometimes get when I do meet people who are Indian that are older than me or even something younger, like, oh, you're American, but you still have you still have an Indian culture. You're still Indian underneath. I'm like, why would I not be Indian underneath? Because if I didn't, why would I not be that? But you just assume that I mustn't be because, again, stereotypes or expectations have been diverted that, oh, you speak the language and you know about these things and done all this stuff. Like you just don't know me. But again, you're making expectations that I couldn't have been this because of X, Y, and Z. And you'll never get away from that. And that'll always be maybe that slight sting, but that sting wears out over time and you kind of look to the future of how that's changed and look at the hope of where it is and know that at least things have gotten better for other people. It's probably maybe not you, it's a little too late for you, but the other people, they're going to be okay. And that's all right too, because again, eventually you'll interact with those people and you'll talk with them and they'll be appreciative and you get to have that cultural diversity that and laugh about some of these silly things that happen and how that comes apart and where it goes. And it is still mind blowing, like to me, because like I said, when I grew up, being the Indian person was such a stigma, and like just being the different race or different ethnicity was such a thing to be bullied or being pushed away from other certain ethnic groups, right? And now those ethnic groups are so blended and it's non-issue. It's like, it doesn't matter. And a friend of mine, we were talking about this about dating specifically, and I said, all right, I'm not saying anything, but like sometimes I date, a few years younger than me, than I am. And I said, why do you not date people in your generation as much? And I said, well, look, my generation was kind of on the cusp. We're kind of something called the lost generation because I'm right in between the millennials and the boomers and in between, and I'm still like in the millennial side. But it's this weird era where you just a lot of things were changing. The internet was coming up, cell phones were happening, like technology was right. There's just so much that happened, right? It blows my mind, like, iPhones like 2008, like really, that's only 12, 15 years ago. It feels like it was forever ago. Like all these things happen so rapidly and accelerated. But one of the things I said about why I tend to date just a little bit younger is because the stigmas and the perspectives and the mindset of the people I date and they're closer to my age is not as open-minded or as willing, and they still have the concerns of like, what's your biodata? Who are you? Where are you from? What is your caste? What's your this? What's your that? Or I'm not sure if I'm open-minded to dating someone of a different ethnicity or this or that. Like, whereas I'm very open-minded because I grew up in such a diverse place and nothing really mattered to me. And then you just go 5 years lower, or maybe somewhere between 5 years or somewhere 5+, we'll say, and the generation gap has happened. And things have changed and the blending has happened and the understanding has happened and the diversity happens. And I say, when I look at like, again, Zoomers and like the late millennials that are like or the youngest millennials, I guess, that are there, we're probably like 25 or 30, right? 20, somewhere there in that age range. they just don't have this concept that those things matter. Because it's so ubiquitous compared to what they've seen through the media, the internet, the movies, their neighborhoods, their families, their schools, like this concept of social, like all those things, they've been so bombarded that, again, those are not questions that they think about. So the blending and mixing of races and cultures and religions and things like that is just easier and smoother. And I think that's a good thing, because a lot of people have more open choice, and to not have to have what I've had to have, being told I was born on the wrong day or that I wasn't having the right job, that was successfully okay to have. But again, when I was looking at my generation, those mindsets are still there. It's kind of like we make the jokes of like, grandpa's still saying the racist stuff from back in there, and we just put him back in the corner because he doesn't know it's not okay to say that anymore. He didn't know that wasn't the right word, but did he change? Did he adapt? Did he realize this wasn't the right way? I have people who are in their 30-ish, like 30, somewhere around 30s. They are having trouble dealing with the pronouns, right, issue that's been changed. I mean, top schools, like that's a thing for them. And they're like, this is dumb. I don't believe in this. This doesn't make any sense. I'm like, I work at a company and I'm required to say these. I had to do this for my last two companies. We have to start accepting pronouns and doing that. It wasn't a big deal because from my perspective, it was like, oh, this is just me being empathetic. I'm trying to be more understanding of a person and understand what can I do to make them feel comfortable and feel respected and valued. And it doesn't really bother me in any way. I don't know. What would you like me to call you? That's fine. But I'm not going to tell you that what you are isn't or isn't good enough or isn't the right thing, right? Instead of telling someone that or being inquisitive of that pressure, like, where are you from? It's, who are you? Of like, who are you and how can I help you? And I think that mindset change of that is there. And again, are they wrong or not? I'm like, no, I think they just don't understand it yet. And then that sometimes is just a generational gap of like, I just don't get it. We've always done this for years. Why would we change it? It's that resistance to change and understanding because they weren't taught or grown up with it and they don't know why that would be there. But eventually sometimes they'll be there. And if not, I made fun of my friends like, well, we'll just roll you into the old folks home just like the other people. I'll just go put you in the corner because you might say something inappropriate that might not be okay when you're 85 years old. And they'll just like, no. They still use he and they. I mean, he and she. We can't let them do that anymore. Hold on. They don't use pronouns. Like, I don't know. It could be something like that as a joke. But I think people forget that they have to adapt to changing times and what's acceptable. And that's a whole different topic that could go about. But I think this is something that comes up as I think about culture. The culture has changed. What's acceptable and not acceptable has changed, both within your culture and the culture you're being forced to live and blend in. And if you want to stay in the good graces of people who are eventually going to be there below you and you have to mentor and train and help with, you need to also understand them and always keep that. As long as you're willing to make the effort to understand people, regardless of where they come from, you're always going to be in a good state.
We're nearing the end of the interview, but we always like to end with a few just fun culture questions. And we generally start with food. Can you tell us some of your favorite Indian foods?
Yes. My favorite Indian food is butter chicken or chicken tikka masala, but neither of those are actually from India. They're from Britain. But like they're made there, but they're not really from it. Technically, they're now known as the best Indian dishes, but it's still my favorite. I love that. But tandoori chicken, naan, basically North Indian cuisine is some of my favorite. And I grew up eating that food constantly, but naan and butter chicken and like saag paneer or bindi masala, which is okra, like spiced okra. Is some of my all favorite, and I get those constantly. I also cook it every now and then, but some of my favorite foods.
Very cool. Okay. So another one we like to ask is, who is your favorite Indian celebrity? And it could be Indian American.
Oh my God. That's hard actually now because I used to know so many of them through Bollywood and movies when I was younger, right? And I'd be like, oh, this girl's so cute. This is my favorite. I don't know what you're like 10 years old watching like these attractive actresses, like, oh my God, she's the one day I'm going to marry her. Like, I have no idea. But now I can't really even think of anything. Honestly, I can't think of any Indian actor, but you know what? I'll go back to my first statement. It's like, I don't know if they're my favorite actor, but again, I really love the acting and what they did in the Never Have I Ever series of how they really portrayed some of the things. And I think they did a good job. So I will give them a plus on that.
Very cool. Very cool.
And then can you tell us, is there something that you, I guess, used to do when you went to India regularly that you would never do in the US or that, I don't know, just maybe wouldn't be acceptable in the US?
Oh man. There's probably two things that come to my mind. I think I would never really throw trash on the ground, but the amount of trash that was being thrown constantly on the ground and with no concern was such a problem. I think that's slowly finally changed a little bit. But in India, I think the other one that really sticks to my mind is the fact that of having servants, right? In India, you could have servants for so little, like almost nothing. And I remember a very striking incident where there was a servant and something didn't go right. And I became a horrible human being. I remember this because I like got very mad and I stomped on this servant boy's like foot. And I was like 10 or 12. Like I wasn't very old either, not much older than the guy. And I felt like, how could I do this? Like I didn't grow up this. I would never do this in the US. I would never retaliate against someone that was, again, I hate to say the word servant, but like that be helping and supporting me in my life. But it's such a cruel thing. And I'm like, how did my personality change in that one instance? And I immediately knew I did something wrong. And I went back and I apologized because I would never do that. But it was a very eye-opening moment of realizing that even with the best foundation and the best thinking and coming from America where you would never have servants, or I mean, you would have butlers or things like that, but not officially a servant, but you would never just retaliate in such a way against someone that was just trying to find or help you in such a way. Like, and I'm like, how did myself change? How did I really started questioning it. Had I grown up in India and I had this I guess culture or ability to have servants and things like that and this lifestyle, would I have become such a different person? Would I have become something I would have hated? I wondered that at that moment, like, oh my God, I could have, because I just did something I never would have done ever before. And yet here I was retaliating a little bit against this kid who was barely older than me. And I thought it was okay for that moment because I let my anger control me. I thought this was okay because the actions of my elder and those told me that this person was beneath me and that this was a person that could be replaced or is needed, but they served you. And that power struggle or that power dynamic was very, very just not a good thing, right? It made you treat people in a poor way. And obviously we know that happens in the US and different, whether you're at a job or you're at a service department or whatever way, people get this hint of power and they realize they can retaliate against others that are less fortunate or may not have the same risk or the same status. And they exude it naturally because it's some way that allows them to do it. And you all think, wow, these people are horrible human beings. And then in that moment, I became that person for a second. And I had to backtrack and go back. And so it was a very deep, revealing moment to me of questioning of, is it okay to always be so upset at people? Because sometimes it wasn't just them. It might've been their circumstances that got them to be who they were, that put them into that place. And that gets into a lot about why certain cultures or certain ethnicities or some people born and raised in certain areas become certain ways because of their environment more than anything else, and how much of an impact that does have on how you are raised. Even if you have the best of intentions and the best of personalities and the best of upbringing, it could flip that fast when you're young until those things are really situated. Mm-hmm. And so a little bit deeper of a question than you probably wanted, but like, there you go. I just
want to go there. Yeah.
But that was a very defining moment. I guess the other fun one is I would never drive like I drive there. So like you'd probably get killed because roads don't matter and you just do whatever you want. It's fine. But yeah, that's a deeper one. And I think it gives me, again, this questioning of, who are you really? Is it really just you, or is it really just you in the time and place and what you've experienced and solidified and make commitments on yourself? This is who I want to be day in and day out. How long can I stick to that before something else changes me to be different?
That got deeper than I expected to. I appreciate the perspective. I guess we'll end on like a kind of a lighthearted one. Is like, do you have like a happy place or just a thing that reminds you? I don't know, when you're in India. That's like, oh yeah, that's just a great memory.
I do. There's two things that come immediately. One is like, there was always a park. There's really beautiful parks that they have in India that you could go around with and see. And that has a lot of memories for different reasons, because when I was young and I was stuck there, I was always going to the park or doing something. So a lot of that was there and coming in. But the other one that really was neat was going to the temples in India, the giant marble statues and buildings and all the, you can go to Italy and see the Vatican, and you can see these religious sculptures for Christianity and all this stuff. You can go to Europe and see amazing things and buildings for like Notre Dame and you can go to other places, but I have never been to one place that had so much spirituality for my religion in a way at the time. And just seeing how that culture and religion, and the flowers are always there, and the smells of the incense they would burn, and like how beautiful the structures were, and all of that was just so amazing. And I always had such a good moment that I always feel most at calm there. I always felt calm. Now, do I always feel calm in like a Sunday school temple where worship is like, no, I never care about that. I just wanted to play around and hang out with friends. But there at those buildings, it was very, very reminiscing. And very spiritual for me in a little bit. Just even if I'm not as religious as I used to be, it was just nice. And it was such a calm place for me to belong, where no one would judge me for my culture because this was my religion. And I was an Indian in India in a place where I could be calm and no one was going to say something to me. And it was that, I think, that I held on to a little bit.
Awesome. That's a great like full circle. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Anuj, so much for like your great answers. It was really in depth, and I got to learn so much about Indian culture and just your background. And we just really appreciate you taking the time to join us. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
I did. It was a really great time. I really enjoyed answering those questions, and I'm glad I hopefully brought some new information and ideas to you and your listeners.
Thanks again to Anuj for taking the time to speak with us. It was so interesting to learn more about his Indian culture and how that has shaped him as a human being. We'd like to thank you listeners for tuning in for another episode. This wraps up our inaugural season of Culture in Between, but you can go back and listen to previous episodes at your convenience. We'd also appreciate it if you left us a rating or review and share the show with others you think might be interested. We hope you've enjoyed listening to the show as much as we've enjoyed interviewing our guests. Stay tuned for Season 2, where we get the honor of sharing more stories. Peace.